Good afternoon. And, well, shall we close the doors or leave them open? Welcome to my first session here, API first building ABL clients based on Swagger. What I'm going to show you within the next hour is some fundamentals about Swagger and OpenAPI. I'm going to show some tooling which is there. And then I'm going to show you how we're using that for building ABL clients that access third-party REST services. Somebody asked here in the beginning whether or not what we're showing here is publicly available or just something that we do in our framework. It will be publicly available probably Friday morning for the workshop, if not very soon after. We just didn't get there yet to extract that bit of the code that we need for this out of our bigger environment, but we will definitely make the generator for the data objects publicly available, together with some description on how to use them. Well, Mike Fechner, working for Consulting Werk. I'm the director there, but I prefer to spend most of my time within our customer projects instead of running the business. I work with our customers as an architect in modernization project, and for our developer tools like Smart Component Library, the WinKit, I'm architect and product manager, well, and very often also developer. The perfect for me is no customer calls, just being able to work on code, but that doesn't happen too often. I'm using OpenEdge since quite a while, actually since I've been 16. Started my summer breaks when I was still going to school, supporting the IT department of my uncle's company in writing a version 5 Progress character application at the time, and then we went to 7, and later I started working for Progress Software for 6 years, and since the year 2000 I'm supporting OpenEdge developers, first as an independent developer or consultant, a freelancer, and then later within Consulting Werk and the team that I founded. We support companies developing in OpenEdge, focus on OpenEdge, but also other technologies that is related to OpenEdge that makes sense to be used with OpenEdge. Our main office is in Cologne in Germany, but we have colleagues in the UK. We have one colleague here in the Czech Republic. He's actually an English person that moved to Czech Republic a couple years ago. We have colleagues in the United States, Peter Judge, who was doing a presentation here before, and 2 web developers in Romania. And we're supporting customers all over Europe. That's mostly what we do. North America, Australia, and South Africa. We provide consulting service and developer tools. So Swagger is something that over the time, slowly but surely, became more and more relevant to us, and because integration of applications becomes more and more relevant. Swagger is basically a tool, a standard, a set of tools that help using REST services or building REST services. It's bringing a documentation of which parameters are needed to access this REST service, with the response and other stuff to REST services. REST services started as being very simple. You just post XML or JSON to an endpoint and you get a response back. But Swagger brings back the knowledge of what to send and what to receive, together with tools that, for instance, allow to test a REST service that you're building or that somebody else has provided for you. And so in integration projects, the standard question becomes, and I actually emailed a customer from the States that asked, sent me an email yesterday evening whether we could help him with an integration project. The first question I answered, does the vendor of the standard application that you need to integrate with provide the Swagger file? So it's now going back to the vendor to find that out. That's kind of like the best documentation of these services. A written documentation, a Word document, PDF file, yeah, it's nice. Sometimes you need that too, but Swagger files should be equally good. So an application might or should provide a Swagger file for services. And when we come to integration projects, a sample that we worked on at the beginning of this year was for a vendor of electronic materials in Austria. They introduced a new warehouse management application. So there needed to be a bidirectional interface between their homegrown OpenAPI ERP system and the warehouse management system. The warehouse management system provided a more or less standardized REST API, which throughout the integration project got customized a little bit. But they had that before, and they also had a draft for a Swagger file that the ERP system should implement so that the warehouse system would know how to make calls to the ERP system, and the ERP system could use the Swagger file to know how to make calls into the warehouse management system. That was one of the use cases. And in the last, more or less in the last 12 months or maybe a little more, we're getting similar requests from new or existing customers almost on a weekly basis. Can you help us with some REST service integration? And we do have a Swagger file, or we need to provide one, and stuff like that. So Swagger can document the REST APIs or RESTful APIs. It's kind of like bringing back the WSDL document that we had with the SOAP web services, but it's not that strict. There's not this, if you send an XML document that doesn't pass a WSDL check, the web service won't accept the call. It's usually less strict. And it helps the developer to test endpoints. You could go on a website that's using the Swagger file that documents the APIs, and there's a test capability usually that allows you to put in the data in structured fields, and then press execute, and then a call is made. You see the response, and you also see what data is being posted there. I'll show that in a couple of minutes. And so it just makes testing much easier. And if you provide web services, the only way to test them is to write a client that accesses them, which would be extra work. But if the specification that you write basically is the test case, then you have a win-win situation there. So within the smart component, but I'm going to talk about that more tomorrow in the session, we have a lot of touching points with REST services and Swagger there. We can well, for every service that we implement in Smart Component Library, we automatically have a Swagger documentation for the technical aspect, and then you can add human-readable text, more explanations to it too. And that allows us to implement new functionality as REST services or provide the existing functionality as REST services. The Swagger documentation is just generated out of the fly. And we support the latest specification there. What I'm going to show in this talk, how we do that, is also the then API-first approaches. So that's when we have a Swagger file, generate a client, that an ABL code that knows how to access that service with the correct input-output data, or generate a client that provides generate a service that provides the same API required there. So but let's look into what is Swagger or OpenAPI. If you use Swagger and OpenAPI as interchangeable terms, I'm fine with that. I do that too. Swagger is the older term, and when they formalized the specification a couple of years ago, was 2016, they used the term Swagger for the tooling and OpenAPI for the specification of the data format. Before, it was all just Swagger, and that's still a common term. It's from 2011, so 13 years ago, so it's around quite a while. And when they formalized the OpenAPI specification in the OpenAPI initiative, big players like Atlassian, Google, and SAP, and PayPal have been supporting that, so it is definitely an industry standard. So what is Swagger? Well, it's a collection of tools that support working with OpenAPI specifications. There's an online editor for Swagger files. There are tools that can generate clients and services for .NET, Java, TypeScript, Node.js, whatever. Not for OpenEdge, unfortunately. That's why we had to do that all ourselves. There's a Swagger UI. That's what most developers, certainly most OpenEdge developers that ever tried the OE Manager REST service that Progress provides to control PaaS have seen. That's a website typically in, a lot of green colors and stuff like that, where you can see the REST interfaces and play with them. There's a Swagger Hub website where you could publish APIs and a testing suite called Swagger Inspector. So that is a sample Swagger page. It's an API, or it should be an API provided by a pet store, and that allows you to make inquiries about pets in the store. So what you see there is a list of endpoints. You see the address of the endpoints together with the description for us. And you see the parameters, and for some you also the expected input payload required to make the request, and then you see the structure, the JSON schema of the expected response. So for the testing purposes, I can just click on the tryout button, fill out the input parameters, so I want to have an available pet in the store, and execute the request. And down here, we see then the response that we've received from the service. So the website has made the request to that backend service. So here it's a service that always returns random data, but according to that, I could get a fish today, another fish, a Doberman, no cats, that's sad, only fish and Doberman. And that's, if that would be a service that I would have to integrate with, I could use this just to familiarize myself with the data that I'm sending and the data that I would be receiving. And since this is a GET request, I also see the request URL, where typically all the input data is being sent. And I could now take this URL and copy it into an empty browser tab and makes the request from here. And apparently Chrome prefers to see the response in XML. I think here I was getting JSON, so that is depending on the service whether it supports XML and JSON and what the client sends at his preferred data format. And I can do the same for requests that update data, so put or post requests. So to upload an image, I could try it out, provide the ID of the pet that I requested earlier, and upload a file to that service and see how the service responds to that. So that's a pet store demo. Another demo that hopefully every OpenEdge developer has seen and used so far, because every OpenEdge developer should be using PaaS is the interface to the OE Manager. The OE Manager is a REST service that you can deploy into an PaaS. You have to deploy a WAR file called oemanager.war, the web archive, and then PaaS provides REST services to see the status of the agents, the sessions on the agents, the connected clients, and you can do some runtime configuration changes using this website. It's very useful. And Progress provides a Swagger page to that too. So if you have a running PaaS instance and you have deployed OE Manager, you can just go to localhost 8820/OE Manager / the trailing slash there is important. If you're not adding the trailing slash, you'll get a 404 resource not find exception or something like that. So And now I'm seeing the Swagger page with the endpoints provided by this OE manager. Well, I'm seeing the Swagger page, and in the top of the Swagger page, I'm seeing the address of the Swagger file. So I could copy and paste that also in the address bar of my browser. And now I'm seeing the JSON file that provides the information about the endpoints. Well, you could also look at it like this, that I've installed in my Chrome a plugin to make JSON files nicer to look at by color coding and allowing me to collapse and expand sessions. So on OpenAPI 12, the OE Manager, when you deploy OE Manager, the Swagger page is automatically enabled on 11.7, but nobody should be in 11.7 anymore. What was it, 169 days or so? That needs to be enabled there. So let's look at what's in the Swagger file. There's a lot of documentation around it, and it took me a while to understand the language of the documentation. But once you got there, it's quite easy. Technically, a Swagger file could be JSON or YAML, yet another markup language. That's a document format which is based on indentation, so the structure is based on indentation. While I'm a huge fan of properly indenting code, I hate YAML. It's just ugly to read. And JSON, we have tooling in the ABL to work with JSON documents, so why not use that? The OpenAPI documentation uses YAML as the samples, but they state that JSON just works equally well. The other source of information are websites like Stack Overflow. There are a lot of samples for Swagger documents, yeah, so you usually find your way around. The YAML and JSON structure, you can convert them from one to the other back and forth. The online Swagger editor supports that, and there are other tools that you can find on the internet that do that. If you go on GitHub and look for YAML to JSON converters, you'll probably find thousands of open source projects that can do that. And probably Julian Smith, is he here? He probably had done an ABL variant to do that, or if not, he would probably do it overnight. So in the Swagger file, there are different sections. There's a metadata section which provides a version of the API, the title and description. There are tags. Tags are a way of grouping endpoints by functionality. If you wouldn't use tags, the endpoints would all be either listed in alphabetic order of the URLs or in the order that they're in the file. That's usually not very helpful. You want to know what are the endpoints that deal with pets. So if you look back at the pet store sample, we have here pet store and user as the three tags. And under these three tags, the various endpoints are grouped. So we know that are kind of like the main objects of that API. Then there's a section that describes actual servers. The endpoints are usually described by relative URLs, relative to an entry point to a server. And there could be multiple servers, and that could be for use cases like a test server, a staging server, and a production server. So a server where you play with test data or with the real data. Paths, that's the actual section that contains the endpoints. I'm going to look into that in a second. Based on relative URLs, the HTTP method get, post, put, patch, delete, whatever, and describes the parameters, the body, and the responses. And there can be a section with reusable schema elements, and there you start thinking of it as like objects that you describe, parameter objects that could be used by multiple methods. Or dataset schemas that could be provided or expected by multiple methods as reusable schema elements to keep the Swagger files smaller and maintainable and easier to read, actually. And there's a section that can describe authentication. The PassOE OE manager typically requires basic authentication. The default password out of the box is Tomcat. Everybody should be advised to change that. Nobody does in development. But the style of authentication is also described there, because to have the full knowledge about how to use the service, you also need to know how to authenticate against the service. And that could be basic authentication, that could be an OAuth2 JOT token or whatever. So when we look at the data models, I mean, that's something that I'm going to focus a lot on this talk. There's the documentation link. And what is described there, it's basically an extended subset of JSON schema, whatever that means. So it's not all of JSON schema, but it also has some extensions. It could be it's describing objects and properties of objects, or arrays of objects or strings. For character fields, there could be formats. It's all based on JSON, so everything which is not a number or not a logical or not an object is a string. A date is a string, for instance. A date is a string with a date format. All this can be described in the Swagger file. Enums, we've seen that in the pet store sample. I could query for pets of a certain status, available, pending, whatever. That's an enumeration of 3 possible values. So that can also be described in the Swagger file. Properties can be having a description, a text that should help us humans to understand what it is, and sample values. That is also something more for us humans to understand what it is. There can be validation, valid ranges, so it could be a minimum maximum length for strings. For numbers or dates, it could be min-max value, and others. So for all the details, please go on the Swagger, on the documentation at Swagger.io. So let's look into the Swagger file of OE Manager. I'm going to do that in an editor here, because that allows me to collapse. So we have the info section that provides the title and the version. Above that is a section which is required that provides the version of the OpenAPI specification. Then we see there's a section with the servers. Here it's OE Manager on my PC, so we have there my PC. Then we have the tags. The tags are just provided with a name and a description. And when we collapse that section here now, we see then comes the biggest section in most documents, the passes. So we see there is a pass documented, which has a lot of hard-coded values, but also 2 variable ones. It's the 2 passes in the curly braces, curly brace app name and curly brace agent ID, that are variable elements in the URL of the request that you're making. We see that this is a delete request. So it's the HTTP method of that request is delete. We see a summary and a description that is both just for us to understand what it's doing. We see an operation ID. The operation ID is a proposal for code generator of a client, how that method should be called. So when I generate an ABL method, an ABL class with a method that knows how to call into this, the proposal is to name that clear agent data. Just a proposal, I can ignore it. If that would be violating the valid names of an ABL method, I could and should use something different. So then I see the 2 parameters that have a name that appear in the path, so that are the 2 placeholders in the URL with the description and the data type. For URL arguments, so path arguments, I would always be expecting a string, because in the URL, a URL isn't type sensitive. So, and then we see that we should be expecting 2 responses. A 200 is the OK case, a 500 is an error on the back end. And if we look for something with more details, the payload, it's this is a request that's describing a put operation. And besides the parameters in the URL, we now have a description of the request body. And this says it's expecting a content type of application vnd.progress plus JSON. So Progress has decided to declare a custom vendor-specific content type. And then the actual schema is described here. And so here we see that this endpoint is expecting to be sent an ABL session active memory limit finish of type string, ABL session active memory limit stop of type string. In this document, unfortunately, a lot of the numeric or Boolean values are actually 0, 1 as quoted strings. So from what you can do with JSON, it's actually quite questionable what Progress did here. But it does the purpose. So to create these Swagger files, or sometimes just to read them or improve them, I'll talk a little bit about some improvements that we've been doing on the OE Manager Swagger file, like describing the authentication. The Swagger file that Progress provides doesn't declare the authentication. So when we generate a client, we wouldn't know that we need to authenticate using basic authentication. Then we have to go into the Swagger editors and change the file ourselves. There's a new editor which runs in the browser. It has a sample file here. No, that's actually remembered my last document. That's interesting. And the nice thing here is you see on the right-hand side the Swagger page, and on the left-hand side the Swagger file. So when you make changes on the left-hand side, very soon after, the right-hand side will refresh and show you the result in the page. The old Swagger editor does the same, it's just a little bit older looking. These editors provide features of converting Swagger files from older versions of the spec into newer ones, converting YAML into JSON and the other way around, and stuff like that. But many other developer tools, IDEs like VS Code, have plenty of plugins available for Swagger. So if I prefer to edit my Swagger files in VS Code, then here we have installed one of the two plugins that I had on the previous slide. And I also see the Swagger page that's the result of the file that I'm editing on the left-hand side. So there's really a lot of tooling in various IDEs. So now when we want to start building an ABL client, we first get a little bit disappointed, because when we go in the Swagger web page and we open the Swagger file there, we can generate clients for many more widely used technologies, but there's still no OpenEdge there. So that's why we have to do something ourselves. So there's no ABL client generator on Swagger.io, but all the stuff that we need to deal with REST clients, REST services, are in recent versions of OpenEdge. But nobody should be on 11.7 anymore, but definitely everything is in 12. There's the JSON object model. I don't know how much Peter talked about that in his previous talk, but he had a couple of classes of that on the slide when I came in. That is a set of classes that allow to build any JSON object in memory of the ABL and write it to disk into long char files and mem pointers. Not any. There's one thing that Progress still can't do with the JSON object model. A number or a string by itself is actually a valid JSON document. A JSON document does not need to be an object or an array of objects or anything. So the primitives true would be a valid JSON object. You can't deal with that. The good thing is I have never actually had to deal with a service that returns true as a JSON document, which isn't a JSON object. But it could happen. You have temp tables and pro datasets that you can turn into JSON and populate from JSON. Most of the time, when we're dealing with standard JSON services or REST services, temp tables and datasets won't help us because the relational structure is typically not that we find there. It's more like on nested objects, and it's just slightly different. So that's why we typically use the JSON object model. So then there's the ABL HTTP client, available since 11.5 or 11.6, with some bugs, and starting 11.7 is actually a useful tool to making REST requests. It's not very fast. If you're dealing with large documents, you will notice that this implementation of the HTTP protocol and parsing the response and the request payloads is much slower compared to the .NET HTTP client. So on 12.8, if we can, we actually prefer to use the .NET Core HTTP client. It's much, much faster. But, well, this works over multiple Progress versions. You don't have to worry about whether or not .NET Core is available on Linux or not. So it's very easy to use. Programming-wise, most of the programs that use it start very similar. You start with creating a client library builder, then the client library builder has a method to build a client. Then you make a request using a request builder to the URL, maybe with additional data, and then you execute the request and you get a response. When you need more parameters, etc., it can become a little bit more complicated. If you do a put request, very similar. Here I create a JSON object because I want to send a JSON object here with all the fields of a customer record to that service. And then we build a request for the put method to that URL. We use that JSON document as the payload that we're sending, setting a content type, headers, whatever is required, and send that request, and then we look at the response. So that more or less is how we can make the requests. With the JSON and the ABL, like I said before, we're not using the temp table JSON methods that often because the progress.json classes are way more flexible to use. So then it would look like that. We create a JSON object, add some properties there, a nested JSON object in the middle. Should be able to use this one. No? There. So I create another JSON object and I add that as a property units to the outer JSON object, and then something more to the child object, and then I write that to a file or some other data structure, and that's then the resulting JSON there. One thing that can be a change for ABL developers, JSON is usually case sensitive. So you should expect that when you write any of these properties with a capital I in the beginning, the service that receives this data won't understand it. It could be nice, but usually not. So then you can have arrays of JSON objects or strings or whatever. It's similar code, something you need to get used to. There's a JSON object model parser that can take an incoming string or long jar or file from disk and parse it and return then the resulting JSON object, which could either be a JSON object or JSON array. So then when we deal with REST services, and that's going to be part of the code that we're open sourcing. Actually, this part is already open sourced in another GitHub repository on that address. We've written a base class that supports a very flexible serialization of properties of an ABL object and nested ABL objects and arrays and lists of ABL objects into a very standardized JSON structure. With the JSON serialization that ABL supports out of the box, we're not always matching the standard. And here we have much more influence on the JSONs. That's why we're using this as a foundation. So, when we look at generation, the things that we should generate are the request and response parameter classes. Because as an ABL programmer, I just want to have an ABL object with real properties that are sent to the service, and all the JSON handling should be happening in the background. Maybe enums, when a property is an enumeration. There's some references of properties in the Swagger document which could say it's that or that. Then you need to define an interface for that type and the actual client to make the request. So when we look at a section from the OE manager Swagger file, then we have set JSON schema for any of those methods with the strings, and yeah, here we have the quoted 1, quoted 0 for logical true or false, which really hurts my eyes when I see that, but good. So I want to turn that into an ABL class with simple properties of the matching data type and the correct name. Because then, as an ABL programmer, I have no risk with the uppercasing, lowercasing of the property names anymore. I have no risk with misspelling a property or using the wrong data type, because I use this class, and it inherits from our JSON serializable and does all the magic with the JSON object model behind. When we further look at the Swagger file from the OE manager, first thing, because we have a spell checker in VS Code, we see that a little bit more 1011 care could go into checking that document because there's a spelling mistake. And that response, the 200 response, we've looked at that earlier, just provided it was successful. But when we executed the request, we actually got the JSON document back, but that was not described. So I didn't know, when I generate a client, I didn't know that actually JSON data is coming back. So that is then one of the cases where we also completed the OE manager Swagger file to have the schema of the response. And we stick with JSON. We didn't declare that as the vendor-specific progress JSON file. Because then we could generate this class out of it, and now we see that we have some simple properties as character, but in the middle, the result, we have a reference to another object type. So we now have two objects nested into each other. But that is what we had been seeing, and that's coming because we're finding here the result as a reference to a schema defined in the same document. And then we assume that the last part of the name here is a class name of that part of the response, and then we become the reusable type in the response. And with our first attempts with using OE Manager that way, we actually did it manually, and OE Manager is a limited API. But in a customer project earlier this year, we had to integrate with CyberSource, and that is a solution for businesses to provide credit card payments to other businesses, kind of like a PayPal for businesses. And their API specification, first it's only available in Swagger 2.0. The Swagger file has 110,000 lines of code. We had to convert it to Swagger 3, the current specification format. And the online editor failed. It was probably too big. But we found other tools to convert Swagger 2 into OpenAPI 3 so that we could start working with our tooling. There aren't a lot of differences between Swagger 2 and 3, but enough to confuse the tooling. But then, to use the create payment endpoint, and that's the one that we needed, we had to create 193 ABL classes. From the outer class nested properties. You see there all the properties are properties of another class, 193. We could have looked at what we need and probably only got away with 20. But then you could be sure that next week the customer calls and say, hey, now if this variant, we need the next 5 ones. So we generated them all. And actually, generation is now key, because if you need to do that manually, 193 of these classes, poor interns that would have to do, if you assume 10 minutes per class, we're at 32 hours. It's almost a week. And what if the specification changes and we need to redo it again? Another week for these poor human beings? How do you test it? So that's definitely, when you get to this scale, either have an API with such a big specification, and I mean, Visa is a company that we might run into another time, then generation is the only option there. So we need a generator for that. And what we typically use as a code generator for things like this is we use the code generator that Progress originally developed for embedded speed script. I don't know who did web speed here 20 years ago and did HTML files with embedded ABL code. It's still there. And it actually also works with the web speed variant in PassOE. And the templating format is actually very similar to other active template engines like EclipseJet or ASP.NET. With active template engines, the template is not just a text file that you copy. The text file contains instructions. The text file could contain conditions, if then else, loops, defined variables, stuff like that. So that's why we use that. If you look at the code of this code generator, well, it's 30-year-old web suite code or 25-year-old web suite code. It's not beautiful, but it works. So, and that's then one of those templates you see in this %, that is executable code. When it comes with the %equal, that are just expressions that are outputted like that. And then text which is outside of any of these %, that's also text that's just generated into the output. And with this, we basically generate, this template generates a generator for the class that I want to generate. So, and we see here we have a class statement, we have a parameter class to this template that provides the package name and the class name. We have the inherit parameter object as a small extension to our JSON serializable. Then within the template, the main part there is we are having a JSON document. We're actually getting into this generator of the classes apart from the Swagger JSON document as a JSON object that describes the properties there. So we're looping through the properties, and each property is an object with a type and maybe a name and format, etc. And in the end, we're defining a property of whatever is the data type. To actually determine the data type, we're using an ABL function here, and that should be a gettable and settable. So that's the code generator for these objects. And if there is validation in the document, we also generate a method that validates them, and you will see the validation for characters. If there is a max length provided in the document, then, well, if length of the property is is greater than the max length, then we return error. So we generate into the class the validation for its own values, so that the class becomes easy to use. So we pass in the JSON schema into the generator. We have slightly customized the e4glgen.p, but in the end, the only change we did, the e4glgen.p generates a web suite specific include file into the generated template code, and we need our own include file, which includes our ABL function for determining the data type, for instance. But that's really the only change. e4gl.gen.p, it's part of the Progress ADE source code. We have a Git repo of that. Progress has a Git repo, so it's very easy to get to the source code of that one. So that's the include file that I mentioned with parameters there and the ABL function to get to the data type. And in the meantime, a little bit extra, but basically that's it. So now let's look at how we're using this, or how we can use then the generated code. So let's start with the OE manager, because we've been talking about that so much. That's a simple.p file that after some initialization just creates an instance of an ABL class, which we named here OE manager transport APSV client. It's a class that contains, I think, 2 properties. If I look into that, I see a method named getProperties_1 and updateProperties_1. I haven't come up with this name, _1. If one of my developers would be coming up with a method _1 and _2 and _4 and 5, I would not be really happy. But if we look into the Swagger file, the Swagger file instructs me to name the ABL method getProperties_1. I could use a better name, but maybe there's documentation around that API that refers to getProperties_1. So, yeah, I mean, since that document is the input to the generator, that's what we stick with. And the getProperties method is getting credentials, that's another object, but it's getting then 2 character properties for the 2 parameters that are described there. And then it calls into a very generic method, but within this method here, you would be seeing we're doing a little bit funkiness around the ABL HTTP client to actually make a request with all that data. I'm going to skip that for the sake of time now. So if I run this program now, my Perso is running. I'm expecting that this get properties now I have a certificate problem. I'm going to use localhost now. So I'm seeing here a JSON object in the ABL, which we turn into the string property with the response of the call. But in this program, which was generated based on the original Swagger document from Progress, the output, the O response, is just a JSON object. And with the JSON object, I just don't know which properties to expect. So after we had fixed the Swagger file, or improved it, whatever you want to refer to it, we made a typed version of it. And now our response is an ABL class called APSV transport properties. And that's the class that I had on the slide earlier. So it has the character properties. It has a result of APSV transport properties, which is another class. And that has various properties, whatever they mean. We're not talking about OE manager here now. And now when I run this method, I can access a property operation of the response, and I can access properties of the nested result object. And when I run that, same HTTPS issue. So now I get these two properties that I ask for, the result property and the adapter enabled of the nested object. And now I can much more, in a controlled way, access the properties, etc. So this API actually allows us also to change properties of the OE manager. So now I make two calls. I make one call to ask for the current properties of this APSV transport. APSV transport is the protocol that PASO uses for ABL clients. And using this REST call, I can actually disable that transport. So if I say, for whatever reason, this PASO should at runtime stop listening to APSV calls, I can use this call to do that. So I do the get properties call. I provide the two input arguments, the name of my ABL web application and the name of the web application. I message that, so up to here it's the same program. But then I assign adapter enabled to 0 and call the update properties. And if I would run this program now, this PASOE would immediately stop listening to APSV calls, and it would actually update the OpenAPI properties file to, after restart, also not accept APSV calls. That has cost me a couple of headaches already when I was surprised why the next day I couldn't connect to my PASOE anymore. So that's why I'm not doing that now. Another sample, we had another customer that has to do business with customers in California, and apparently the sales tax, so similar to the VAT rate, can be different based on the address where you are. And to deal with that, the state of California provides a REST service where you can put in an address and ask for the tax rate. I don't know how taxes work here in Czech Republic, but in Germany it's just dependent on the type of goods you're buying, but okay. So, and this is documented here, and there's also a REST API request tool. They're not naming it Swagger, but you recommend that that's Swagger with a different style sheet. And if you look into the source code of this web page, you would see that this web page is also referring to this Swagger document. So the customer asked us whether we can generate a client for that. There's a tax rate DTO class defined there. DTO is typically a naming suffix for objects that are generated just for the purpose of transferring data transfer object. So that probably means that within the application they have a different data structure, but on the interface they're referring to these DTOs. Based on that, I would guess that they've used .NET for implementation, because I've met this DTO naming suffix more in .NET implementations than in the Java world, but you never know. So, and we used the same tooling to generate a client and the parameter classes. So when I want to know now the sales tax for Apple in Cupertino, it's in California, then I can put in this address into the request. The method is called get rate by address. There's another get rate by latitude and longitude. And yeah, if I run this one, well, you still see the result from the previous one, but you can do it live. I'm now seeing the sales tax at Apple in Cupertino is 9.125%. Whatever that means. I'm not a tax advisor from California. But if we look into the client implementation, again, generated, it knows the endpoint coming out of the Swagger document, or it knows the server address. Then we have the method generated, and we have the get rate by address method, putting in the address, city, zip code. Whatever the description was in the document, we have that as comments here. We prepare the request, call into a generic HTTP request, and return then the text rate DTO object. The text rate DTO object returns potentially a list of text rates. So in this case, I'm now using the rate property of the first text rate info object that came from there. So that means as the ABL developer dealing with the service, you really don't have to know anything anymore about the implementation, about whether it's JSON or XML or whatever. It is like you wrote this method based on OpenEdge code and then all the text rates into an OpenEdge database, and it's just a simple find. Good. So, on the slides also the sample code. Yeah, like I said earlier, one of the exercises that we did for making a better client for the Swagger files, we had to fix the OU Manager OpenAPI spec. I don't know whether we can be putting that on GitHub. I think I'll have to ask Rob Strader also whether Progress thinks they have intellectual property on the original one, and when we make modifications, we would breaking their IP. I'm pretty sure we can make modifications for our own purposes, but yeah. And the couple of things that we would be making different. I mean, we would be adding the response schema, we would be adding the authentication schema to the file, we would be providing the list of servers, we would provide better method names than getProperties_1 to getProperties_5. We would not be using quoted 1 and 0 for logical values. Yeah, so we'll either use a Boolean or maybe an enum. But I cannot make an ABL enum with 1 and 0 as member names, because the member name of an enum needs to start with a character. So, yeah, so there's some room for improvement. So that's what we did there, and yeah. Yeah, future, I will have a word with Rob, what he thinks there, or whether Progress would take that as an improvement idea, but then it would probably take years to get changed. We'll have to see. Yeah, we'll be open sourcing parts of the implementation, so the actual generator engine and our templates. We have some graphical tooling around it to pick the methods that we actually want to have. Those will be parts of our framework product, but the actual generation engine, something that hopefully for Friday, if not very soon next week, will become open sourced on GitHub. Well, let's first finish this event. Anybody has some questions? Everybody's thirsty. Then thank you for your time, and see you soon.